Hi everybody! This video goes over some basic vocab that we often use when we're talking about fiction. A lot of these terms may be familiar to you from past classes that you've taken. However, because we'll be using these terms in this class, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what these terms mean and how we can use them to talk about the novels that we'll be reading in this class. So the terms that I'm going to be going over are genre, setting, characterization, plot, narrator, narrative points of view, including first-person point of view, third-person limited point of view, third-person omniscient point of view, and then also theme. So the first term I'm going to talk about is genre. A genre is a type of creative work that follows recognizable rules, and these rules are often called conventions. There's three main genres in literature: poetry, drama, and fiction. If you've read any of these genres, you know that they're pretty different from each other. So when we read poetry, we expect it to look a certain way, and we may expect it to sound a certain way. When we see a work of drama, a play, we expect it to look different from a poem. So we expect there to be characters, and we expect the characters to say things, and we expect there to be directions for the characters to do things. And then when we read a work of fiction, we expect it to look a little different from these two other genres and to have sort of different rules that it follows. And so these rules and these expectations that we have for these different genres are called conventions. This class is going to be focused on the genre of fiction. So most of the work that we read will follow these conventions that we associate with stories and novels. So they'll have characters, they'll have plots, they'll have narrators. However, they may also experiment with some of these conventions as well. So they may break some of the rules in order to get us to sort of rethink some of the rules of the genre of fiction. The second term I'll be talking about is setting. So the setting is the time and place in which a story or novel takes place. For example, most of the Harry Potter novels are set in the imaginary school of Hogwarts during sort of the late 1990s and early 2000s. Setting can also include the larger environment of the story or novel, such as it's the political, cultural, or legal backdrop. And again, if we think about the sort of example of Harry Potter, there's sort of a whole background to the Harry Potter novels, including a complicated political struggle between those who support Voldemort and those who oppose him, and that sort of erupts in different kinds of ways. So setting can be really sort of specific, but it can also include a lot of other sort of background elements that also impact the story. The next term we'll be talking about is characterization. So you're probably familiar with the word or the term character, which is sort of a person that's within a story or a novel. And characterization is the process of delivering information about that character, including the character's personality, but also maybe other things to the reader. And there's different ways that writers do this. Direct characterization happens when a narrator or another character explains an aspect of the character. So, for example, a character in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone might tell Harry that Draco Malfoy is a jerk. And so, as readers, we're like, aha, someone is telling us that Draco is a jerk. Indirect characterization happens when a character reveals something about him or herself through their own words and actions. So, for example, Draco might bully a younger kid. And then, as readers, we're like, aha, he's a jerk. So we get that information in a slightly more indirect way. The next term I'll talk about is plot. So plot, as you probably know, refers to the sequence of events that happen in a story or novel. The plot of many, although not all, stories and novels follows a pattern that looks something like this. So it begins with exposition, in which the setting and the characters are established and the primary conflict is introduced. And then there's rising action, in which the primary conflict intensifies and the narrative tension builds. And there's a climax, which is the highest level of tension, in which you as a reader don't know what's going to go on or what's going to happen. And then there's falling action, in which the primary conflict is resolved and the narrative tension begins to dissipate. And then you have the resolution, which is when everything sort of is wrapped up and concludes. However, as I sort of alluded to earlier, not every story and not every novel follows this sort of structure. So this can be a useful way of talking about the plot of a story or novel, but don't assume that a story or novel is going to follow this. Sometimes they have multiple sort of peaks and arcs or multiple climaxes. Or sometimes a writer intentionally writes a story that sort of subverts this and doesn't really have a lot of narrative tension. So you just want to pay attention to how the writer is either sort of relying on this pattern or maybe playing with this pattern in their writing. The next term I'll talk about is narrator. So as you probably know, a narrator is the person who's telling the story or who's sort of narrating the novel. Sometimes the narrator is a character within the story or novel, and sometimes the narrator is a person outside of the story or novel. It's also important to remember that the narrator is not the same thing as the author. So even when a narrator has access to characters' internal thoughts and feelings, now we shouldn't assume that the narrator is voicing the author's thoughts or opinions. Sometimes the narrator might be doing that, but we can't assume that. So the narrator, the person who's speaking and telling us the story, is going to be probably at least somewhat different and distinct from the actual author. So the narrator, for example, of Kindred is not Octavia Butler. Octavia Butler's the author. She's the person who wrote it. The narrator is the person who's telling us the story. And then related to that is narrative point of view, which is also sometimes called narrative perspective. And this refers to the point of view the narrative is being told from. And this, by point of view, I mean sort of who the narrator is, and then also what kind of information the narrator has access to. So there's three basic point of views that we usually talk about, or that are fairly common in fiction. The first of these is a first-person point of view. So a story or novel told from the first-person point of view is told by a character inside the story or novel. In this kind of narrative, the narrator doesn't know anything beyond what he or she has witnessed. So, for example, Kindred, the first novel that we're reading, is told from the perspective of Dana, and she's a character within the novel. The things that happen to the novel directly impact her. And she can only describe things that she's seen or experienced or things that other people have told her. And that really limits the information that she can provide to us as readers. A different kind of narrative point of view is a third-person limited point of view. So a story or novel told from a third-person limited point of view is told by a narrator outside the story who only has access to a few characters' thoughts. So this is someone who isn't a character within the actual story, but someone who only really tells us about one or two people's thoughts or what they're feeling. So, for example, the Harry Potter novels, which I already mentioned, are told from the third-person limited point of view. There's a narrator who's telling us what's happening, and this narrator isn't a person that's within the novel, so it's not like Harry or Hermione or Ron or any of those people. And the narrator only reveals what one character, usually Harry, is thinking or feeling. And there's a few exceptions to this, but generally speaking, the narrator is really only focusing on Harry's thoughts and Harry's feelings. She's not telling us what other people are thinking or feeling. And then the last point of view I'll talk about is the third-person omniscient point of view. So a story or novel told from a third-person omniscient point of view is told by a narrator that's outside the story and who has access to all of the characters' thoughts. So this kind of narrator will sort of jump from one person to another and sort of jump into and sort of tell us what's going on in the mind of each character rather than focusing on just one character. And for example, if you've read it, The Scarlet Letter is told from a third-person omniscient point of view. The narrator is not a character within the novel, so it's not Hester or Arthur Dimmesdale or one of those people. And the narrator reveals what multiple characters are thinking and feeling at different times. So sometimes the narrator tells us what Hester is thinking. Sometimes the narrator tells us what, Arthur Dimmesdale is thinking. Sometimes the narrator tells us what other people are thinking or feeling. So we sort of have this almost godlike point of view where we sort of jump from character to character and have access to all of their thoughts and all of their feelings. Okay, and then the last term that I want to talk just a little bit about, which is different from narration, is theme. So as you probably know, a theme is an abstract idea like, say, love or friendship or memory that a story or novel explores. However, I also want to point out that identifying the theme of a story or novel is only the first step in analyzing it. Once you've sort of figured out what that theme is, it's also important to pay attention to how it's developed and what the author is saying about the theme. So, what is the writer telling us about love? What is the writer telling us about friendship? What is the writer telling us about memory? And that's what often sort of the process of analysis is. It's not just saying this is the theme, but trying to figure out how that theme is being presented, and sort of what sort of novel's perspective on that theme is. So I hope that this provides a starting point for our discussion of the various novels that we'll be reading, and I look forward to getting to know all of you a little bit better as the class progresses.